Good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining this session on how to prepare for a Home Office sponsor licence compliance visit. Just to get started then, I am Elaine McIlroy. I'm a partner in the Employment and Immigration team at Brodie's, and presenting with me today is Erin McLafferty, who is an associate in the team, and we'll both be speaking as we go. And before we run through the agenda, just to put some context around the session. So the purpose of today's session is to give employers some practical tips about how to prepare for a compliance visit. And any employer who's got a licence is likely to receive a compliance visit at some point during the lifetime of the licence. Some employers are unlucky and have more than one, and others have waited a long time and not had one, but at some point you're likely to have one. And it's one of the conditions of having a sponsor licence that you agree to give UK Visas and Immigration access to your premises to come and do a compliance visit, and you agree to cooperate with them and provide them with information, etc. So the purpose today is not to go through what the actual compliance duties are, and we've got separate sessions on that, which are on Brodie's website and we can refer you to later, but to give you some practical tips about how to actually prepare and an overview of what a compliance visit's actually like. So for the agenda for today, I'm going to start by talking about some background and the risks arising out of a visit if you get it wrong. We'll talk about the types of visit that there are, so the difference between a pre-license assessment visit and a post-license one, and the difference between announced and unannounced visits, what information you might be asked for in advance of the visit, who UKVI expect to meet on the day, and then what issues UK Visas and Immigration typically ask about on a visit. And we'll finish off with some top tips as well to prepare. So, as I mentioned, I would flag some of the key risks to be aware of arising out of a visit. And I suppose a visit is an opportunity for UK Visas and Immigration to scrutinise your processes, and if they find that anything is amiss or there are any compliance breaches, there are a number of risks that could arise from that. So I guess we've got on the slide financial risks, operational risks, and reputational risks. And in terms of the financial ones, one consequence if they find that there are relatively minor breaches is that they might impose an action plan, and the action plan sets out required improvements that you're obliged to make within a period of kind of up to 3 months, at which point they would come to do a follow-up visit to see if you've made the required improvements. And in order to agree the action plan, the employer pays a fee of £1,476. So you pay for the privilege of having the action plan, and then you agree to make those required improvements. And if the employer hasn't made the improvements needed, then there are a couple of options. Either their license might be revoked at that point, or alternatively, you might be given a further period to make required improvements, but you can only have up to 2 action plans during the period of your license. So those are some of the financial consequences. Of course, there are illegal working civil penalties of up to £20,000 for each illegal worker if that's the type of breach that they spot. So that's the second type of financial risk. The operational risks, however, are probably the most major ones. For many employers these days, they'll rely on their sponsor license to fill key roles, and for some employers, they might also sponsor a large number of people. And some of the operational risks, if you are given an action plan, you're given what's called a B rating. That means that you can't sponsor new migrant workers during the period of that action plan. They will allow you to extend, I guess, the visas of people you currently employ during that period. But those operational restrictions, even at the stage of having an action plan, can be significant. So it stops you going out recruiting and hiring the people that you need. In the worst case scenario, if you lose your license altogether, then that means even existing people that you already sponsored are likely to have their leave to stay in the UK curtailed, usually curtailed to 60 days. And in that period, they need to go off and basically find themselves a new job with a sponsor that can sponsor them, or possibly have to leave the UK. And in cases where the migrant worker was seen to have sort of colluded with the employer or breached anything, they could even have their leave curtailed right away. So those sorts of, even the employment law aspects of having to deal with stopping sponsoring certain people and stopping employing them are obviously significant risks. In addition, it's worth bearing in mind if you do lose your licence, you can't just go off and apply for a new one tomorrow. There's a cooling off period which stops you doing that, usually for 12 months. So operational risks are probably the biggest risk for most employers to take into account. Finally, reputational risks, of course, for legal working breaches. The UKVI sort of name and shame and publish lists of employers who are guilty of those or are given civil penalties. And also, if you were to lose your license, in some cases where it's a big name employer, that's actually hit the press and things. So you don't want that kind of reputational risk, which is why it's important to get it right. So if we just move on to the next slide. So in terms of how many visits UKVI actually do tend to undertake on an annual basis, they do publish statistics on this, and they also publish some stats about the compliance action that they take. And some key messages then to take away from this slide are more employers than ever have now got a sponsor license. There's been a 27% increase just over the last year, and we've got more than 45,000 employers on the register of sponsors. And people are sponsoring more workers now than at pre-pandemic levels. Compliance visits are common, and I've put up there some statistics from both the first half of 2020 and also if we look forward to the first half of 2022. So just by way of example, they did 640 compliance visits in the first half of 2020. About a third of those resulted in people having their sponsor license suspended, and in about a third of other cases they were revoked. So actually, for those who get visits, there's quite a high risk of compliance action. That might be partly explained by the fact that the UKVI do take a risk-based approach in terms of who they visit, etc. But yeah, the risk of compliance action is real. It's not just theoretical. And if we compare that then to the first half of 2020, there's similar numbers, like 214 licenses suspended and 271 revoked. So it is a significant number again that do get compliance action. And we'd put up there the number of unannounced visits during COVID. They obviously pre-planned visits a lot more, but that's reverted to a lot more unannounced visits at the current time. If we just move on to the next slide, I'll hand over to Erin at this point.
Thanks, Elaine. So yes, as Elaine touched on, some visits on those statistics there were unannounced, and I guess the main nature of compliance visits does tend to be unannounced. UKVI do prefer, and in line with their guidance, do prefer to just appear at sponsors' doors and undertake an audit without any prior notice. But they can, in some occasions, pre-plan those visits, and that was a bit more common during COVID. But I would say always be prepared for an unannounced visit, because that's definitely the preference that UKVI have. The policy guidance in place does require sponsors to allow Home Office staff access to their premises or sites that are under their control on demand. So if UKVI do turn up at your door, you should let them in. If you fail to do so, then UKVI will record that as non-compliance, and that might impact your ability to keep your licence or kind of suffer from those risks that Elaine mentioned earlier on in the session. If you have any migrant workers that you sponsor who are working at a third-party site where that's permitted under the rules, then it is important to ensure that you have arrangements in place with your own clients, because UKVI can also appear at their sites, and the third-party client in question is obliged to also grant them access. So it's important from your perspective as the sponsor to ensure that your clients are aware of that. It's important to also have a think about what your plan would be if you were to receive an unannounced visit. Do you have processes in place? Would reception, for example, know who to get in touch with? Would they know who to call? Would you be able to get the information that's needed as part of the visit quickly? Having a think about that in advance makes sense. It can help take some of the stressors off of the day if that was to happen, if you've got a kind of robust plan of who should get contacted and what would need to be collated at short notice. There's also then two different types of sponsor licence assessments that can be undertaken. I guess the three main trigger points for a compliance visit are usually at the point you're applying, and that's called a pre-licence assessment visit, and that's before your licence is granted. Then there is to other kind of trigger points, which are usually at the point that you're extending your sponsor license, which is after the license is in place, of course, and then also at any point throughout the lifetime of your sponsor license. And both of those would be what we call post-license assessments. The main difference is that a pre-license assessment essentially means that you will be unlikely to have any sponsored workers, and that means that the questions and information that UKVI ask may be slightly different to those that they would ask who already got a license in place. The types of things they'll look at are your HR systems, any questions that they may have about your license application itself or any gaps in their knowledge. They might also check if you've got roles that are eligible for sponsorship. But the key difference is that they cannot use the individuals that you sponsor as a measure as to whether you meet the sponsor license requirements or not. And that's different to a post-license assessment. I guess in those circumstances, the license is in place, and normally they will look at those that you currently sponsor, they'll look at the information you keep for them, your HR processes for complying with sponsor license obligations, and they will also interview those that you sponsor. So they're essentially looking at the same type of information, but how they assess it might be different depending on whether it's a pre or post-license assessment. And if you are notified that you're going to get a sponsor license audit or a compliance audit, UKVI will usually ask for some information in advance. We've got some examples of the documents we've seen asked for in the past from sponsors. Those include things like company ownership structure charts, organisation charts, information on turnover, HR policies, so sickness absence reporting, holiday reporting, right to work processes and things like that. Also your latest RTI returns, lists of employees with national insurance numbers and things like that. So I guess being prepared to provide these at short notice makes sense. If you're given deadlines with UKVI, please ensure that you stick with them and that you give UKVI the documents within those timeframes to make sure you get off on the right foot with UKVI. But I guess the documents requested can vary depending on the organisation, the number of people you sponsor, if any, and I guess the kind of circumstances that have led to the visit itself. I'll pass back to you now, Elaine.
Thanks, Erin. So a question we're often asked is who UKVI would expect to meet on a compliance visit. The authorising officer, and that's the person, I guess, who makes the licence application at the beginning and who's responsible for kind of oversight of the compliance duties that the sponsor has, is somebody that UKVI is likely to want to meet. Also, on some occasions, the key contact, and that might be the same person for some employers. Also, those individuals involved in recruitment and in some cases level 1 users too. And I think that sort of depends on the business and who has the information. In some smaller HR departments, that might be all sort of the same people. In other cases, you might need to involve individuals, say, in a recruitment function if they've got access to the records on that. So it really depends on how your organisation works as well. If the authorising officer or key contact aren't available on the day, what do you do? Well, UKVI acknowledge that they may be unable to speak to the authorising officer or key contact, and in that case, their caseworker guidance sort of suggests that they should speak to other individuals who might have the information that they need. So that might be other sort of general managers in the business, etc. If it's not possible for them to get the information that they need on that occasion, they may need to revisit, but usually in many cases, someone else will hopefully be able to fill in, and it might be possible to use video calls, etc. if somebody was remote working, for example. But it does make sense in terms of having a plan to have more than one person in your business who's prepared to deal with a visit, because somebody might be on holiday or might be off sick, etc. And also your authorising officer, as I said, they're kind of responsible for that oversight in relation to compliance duties. It does make sense for them to be sort of briefed enough in terms of what the sort of key sponsor obligations are and what your HR processes are in terms of that reporting and record keeping, etc., so that they can have, I guess, a sensible conversation with UKVI and answer their questions. They can, of course, be supported by other people who are involved from HR, etc., but it does make sense for them to know roughly what is expected and who the business sponsors, etc., and what your procedures are. Sponsored workers might also be interviewed to check that they're doing the job that they are supposed to be doing, and that it is at the required sort of skills level, and to check that they are indeed being paid what the sponsor system shows that they're paid. So that's a bit of sort of verification to make sure that everything is in order. In terms of the areas that UKVI typically consider in a compliance visit, as I said, the purpose of the session today is not to get into this in lots of detail. We do have another session which is recorded on the Brodie's website, which gets into the detail of those compliance duties a lot more. And on UKVI's website, they always keep up to date guidance on compliance duties. So there's a sort of whole written document with the detail of that. But roughly what they're looking at are your procedures on right to work checks. They want to make sure that you've got a process for checking right to work documents before the person starts work and also prior to the expiry of any visa, and that you've got a diary system in place for that. They will look at whether you have processes to maintain details, contact details for your migrant workers. So that's home address, mobile telephone number, etc. And you're supposed to have a history of that and a system for keeping that up to date. They will check that you've got appropriate record keeping systems, and there is a document available online on UKVI's website that tells you exactly what records you need to keep for your migrant workers. They will check that you've got systems in place to report changes which UKVI require to be made in relation to individual workers, but also the business. So they'll look at the systems and processes that you've got in place to demonstrate that you can comply with those. And then finally, general sponsor duties. That's about dealing with them in good faith, etc. So that's a very, very brief overview of what they're actually looking at. And one question we've put onto, sorry, we just go back onto the slide there is, what if they visit one site and the records are held elsewhere? Well, these days a lot of records will be held electronically, so hopefully you can access what you need wherever you're based. But if you do have sort of paper records that are kept locally on one site, etc., their own caseworker guidance suggests that they'll give you some time, although it might be quite short timescales, like a few days, to produce the records that you weren't able to produce on the day. But if you are planning for a visit, making sure that you can access the documents that you need and information that you need quickly is a good sort of tip. So we've just put up there an example, a sort of practical example of a business that we dealt with, had when dealing with a pre-license visit. So in their case, they got a compliance visit before they were granted the sponsor license. And this was a manufacturing business. They had a shortage of staff in sort of medium skilled roles, and they just decided to get a sponsor license for the first time. They were actually given a couple of months notice of a visit, and this was during COVID times, so that may have made a difference in terms of the timescales involved, and also the fact that more visits were sort of pre-planned at that time due to COVID restrictions. When they eventually then got a date for it, the visit took place a couple of weeks later. In advance of the visit, they were contacted to ask for information on their company structure, an org chart, details of their turnover, policies that they had for managing migrant workers. They were asked for a copy of their proposed contract of employment, their RTI return, so that's the payroll information, and a full staff list with their national insurance numbers. They also did have a call with UKVI the day before the visit themselves, and they had a discussion about what UKVI wanted to look at. And they were told that they would look at right to work processes, their details of their recruitment processes, details of the jobs that they had that they intended to sponsor for, their processes for managing absences, so holiday and sickness absences, details of pay rates to be paid to those who would be sponsored, etc. So all of the sorts of information that you would expect. And on the day, they met with the authorising officer, and in that case, that was the same person who was also the key contact and level 1 user. And they spent time discussing aspects of the licence application itself and the recruitment and other HR processes. And they were given a notification a few days later that their licence was to be granted, and they were granted the licence a couple of weeks later. So hopefully that gives you an idea about how the timing, etc., can work for a pre-license visit. Erin, do you want to take over at this point?
Sure. So I'm just going to talk about some top tips and things to think about to be prepared for a sponsor license compliance visit. So first of all, we recommend that you undertake your own audit annually of all of your kind of UKVI compliance obligations. So that includes auditing your files, checking your processes. It's much better for you to discover any issues because then you have an option to rectify them, compared with UKVI coming in and finding issues and then perhaps them being put on their list of non-compliance. Also, in particular, have a look at your legal working processes. They are critical. Check your diary systems for those that have time-limited right to work in the UK when their visas are expiring. Is there a notification in a diary somewhere to tell you that that's the case? Also have a think about how you deal with expiry dates on visas. Check that you don't have any gaps or missing information on right to work files. That is an area that UKVI will look at a compliance visit, so that's really critical. Other hotspots that we have kind of noticed, or trends that we've noticed, are things such as employers not retaining recruitment evidence for people that they sponsor, there being out-of-date information on the SMS about the organisation or those that are being sponsored. For example, job changes not being notified, places of work not being updated. So if someone's working from home or in a hybrid manner, that not being notified to UKVI. Also, new branches or locations or sites not being added to the sponsor management system, or changes in places of work for people that sponsor. Those are all kind of common hotspots, but if in doubt, I guess pulling out the guidance, checking exactly the types of things that have to be reported to UKVI is recommended, and then checking your records against that. Also ensure that all your key personnel do have oversight of, I guess, the sponsor license and the obligations that come along with that, and that they're sufficiently briefed to speak to UKVI if necessary, even if that was to be accompanied by HR. As mentioned by Elaine, the authorising officer is one of the people that UKVI will typically want to speak to, so they should be broadly familiar with compliance obligations. Level 1 users should also be logging in monthly to check that there's nothing on the kind of a notice board on there, and UKVI do remotely check that, so they are in a bit of a pattern of checking in with sponsors to see when their level 1 users are logging on, so that is really important. Also, having a think about whether your authorising officer has a system in place to check the certificates of sponsorship that are being assigned at least once a month. Can they be briefed by the level 1 user, for example, or do they have access, level 1 user access himself to go on and check that? That is an obligation, so it's a type of thing that you should have a process in place for. As I touched on earlier, also having a think about whether you can put a plan in place if UKVI were to come and undertake an audit unannounced, making sure that reception, for example, know who to get in touch with and who the key people in the organisation would be if that event was to happen. Also making sure that you could obtain the relevant documentation if needed at short notice. So if it's held at a different site, as Elaine mentioned, you might be given a bit of extra time, but even where you've got electronic files, making sure that they're accessible by you in the organisation and that you're not, for example, relying on a third party to download and send them over to you would be important. Also, if you have a compliance visit and UKVI indicate that there are any issues, it's really important to make sure that you ask for notes from the compliance officer that's undertaking the visit. They are obliged to provide them, and actually they can be absolutely critical to whether or not you keep your licence. And in that type of situation, we would say definitely take your own advice to make sure you don't prejudice your ability to keep that licence. And before we move on to the kind of Q&A portion of the session today, I thought I would just flag that Brodie's do carry out compliance audits. So we do regularly help clients with auditing their files, going through the types of information that UKVI would look at, and essentially doing a bit of a mock audit. We will send a bit of information on that service after the session today, along with the slides. But if you've got any questions, please feel free to reach out, and we're happy to discuss how that kind of audit may look. And we can also talk about costs and pricing for that. So we'll just get into the questions and answers then. I think we've had some come through. So first of all, we've had a question asking, how long does a visit typically last?
I think the duration of the visit partly depends on the business. So I guess there might be some smaller businesses where a visit doesn't take that long. I guess there's sort of standard questions and information that they'll go through. And if, for example, there were no migrant workers already, and like the example that I gave, there might not be lots of people to sort of interview and speak to, then it might be sort of relatively short. In other cases, if you were a much larger employer, so for example, say a university that sponsored lots of people and there's lots of paperwork and lots of different people to sort of speak to, then the visit may well be more in depth. So it's not a kind of one size fits all approach. There's a kind of standard guidance that UKVI follow, but the actual duration would depend on the circumstances. And I've got one question here for you, Erin. So in terms of migrant workers, it mentioned in the session that it was typical for some of those to be interviewed. Is there a specific number that tend to be interviewed, and how does that kind of work?
Yeah, so UKVI will normally want to speak with people that are being sponsored. The number that they want to speak to depends on how many you sponsor. So their kind of starting point is usually to speak with 3 sponsored workers. However, if you sponsor less than that number, then they'll probably want to speak to everyone that you sponsor. Of course, that can change on the day depending on who's available. If people are, for example, working from home or they are on holiday, then UKVI might kind of be a bit more flexible with that. But if it's possible to, for example, have them call in, then that would be useful. And you can speak to the specific compliance officer about that. But generally, they'll want to speak to 3, or usually around 3 sponsored workers if possible. We've had another question come in. So someone has asked, what if our authorising officer isn't very close to our HR processes in practice?
Yeah, as I mentioned, I guess earlier on, if you've got the authorising officer in place and they don't have, I guess, lots of detail about, say, the precise absence monitoring procedures or holiday procedures, etc., it's fine to involve other colleagues in sort of explaining what processes you've got in place. But it does make sense for the authorising officer to be briefed, to some extent on what the sponsor duties are, what the organisation does about those, and they should know things like how many people are sponsored by the business. They're obliged to sort of review that, I think, sort of once a month to know how many people you do sponsor. So they should be sort of close enough to it that they can talk sensibly about it, but it's fine to also bring in other colleagues if they're responsible, for example, for your sickness reporting procedures to talk about that bit, or if there's someone else in charge of recruitment records and record keeping, it's fine to involve other people. But the AO should have that sort of broad overview. And if they do want further information about what the sponsor duties are, there is information online on UKVI's website. And it makes sense for them to sort of keep up to date with that because it does change regularly. Let us know as well. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.